Hi, I'm G, and in this video I'm trying to paint with watercolors in a more watery and expressive kind of style. And the first thing that I need to start with is my photo reference. Now, normally I would use my own photo reference, but here I just decided to go with this picture that I sort of tore out of a food magazine. And I'm painting on De La Rowney, the Langford paper, and it's not cold press paper, and it's 300 GSMs in thickness. And I'm also going to use a bigger brush, a size 8 round, so that I don't get too fussy. That's the idea anyway, that if it's too big a brush, I just can't get too fussy with my brush work and start overloading with details and stuff. Now, because I don't usually work in this way, I'm trying to keep it as simple and as easy for myself as possible. So I'm just using one color here, that cadmium scarlet. And what I'm doing is I'm mixing a very watery, really pale version of that. So just this single color, and then I'm in there with my big brush straight away. And I'm also trying to hold it a little bit further up the barrel of the brush, not too close to the metal bit. I find that when I hold the brush really close to the metal bit, I start to get a bit noodly and a little bit fussy. So I'm thinking, holding the brush a little bit further back, hopefully I should be able to get slightly more expressive brushwork. So here you can see me laying down that first color for that first cherry tomato, and I'm leaving little white areas of paper. Those are going to be those lovely bright shiny highlights on the skin of the tomato. So I'm leaving those as I go along. Now, some of the cherry tomatoes in the reference photo are they're against each other, they're touching each other, they're overlapping each other. So I'm deliberately painting in the same way here, so that what you will find is some of the color will run from one cherry tomato to the next. And I'm okay with that, because this is the kind of effect that I'm trying to achieve, something a little bit less tight than what I'd normally do. And here you can see me now going in with some raw cadmium scarlet and just dropping that in, because I'm a little bit, oh, that color's too pale, and I get a bit impatient. So I'm just getting raw color on that brush, and you can see me just dropping it in. And of course, because the paint on the paper is already wet, what happens is that paint that I'm dropping in just spreads outwards a little bit. It only spreads so far, it won't go too far and completely make the painting the exact same color. It'll have these kind of areas that are lighter, areas that are darker, and sort of like mid colors in between. Now, I hear people saying that when a seasoned watercolorist works in this way, they've got a good idea of where that paint's going to go, and they're actually quite controlling of it. But I don't feel that it works that way for me, and I know that when I'm doing this, I'm letting go quite a bit of control. Yes, I'm popping in little bits of color, and I'm hoping it's going to be roughly in a spot, but it could flood a bit too far. I might put on way too much water, and I get a kind of background type bloom effect, and it's still quite an unknown quantity. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to turn out, but that's, again, part of me painting this in a more expressive way, is kind of giving up, relinquishing some of that control in order to produce a more expressive and more fluid, hopefully, watercolor. So here you go. I'm still putting on the lighter cadmium scarlet wash, but it's got mixed with a tiny bit of green that was in the palette already. So again, I'm just like, okay, that's fine. I'm going to roll with that. That's okay. And then you can see me dropping in some more of that nice raw color straight from the half pan and dropping it in at the top against the edges. So I guess what I'm trying to do a little bit as I move through this is try and accentuate and add some kind of clarity to the edges and make them a bit darker, but then other parts of the cherry tomato so far are going to be paler and lighter. So I've wanted to paint in this way for quite a while. I usually don't. If you've seen any of my other watercolor videos, you know how kind of tight, controlling, when I'm doing a flower picture, it's petal by petal. You know how careful I am about those, you know, trying to make them accurate and always trying to break out a little bit and trying to do something that's a bit expressive, but I keep on coming right back to being really detailed and really fussy. So I wanted to paint like this for a while and also document it and share it with you guys on YouTube. But I moved house recently, and I found I suddenly had kind of the fear. I had kind of artist's block. And for a good month after we moved, you know, I convinced myself, oh, it's because I'm unpacking boxes and I'm doing this and I'm busy, blah, 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 blah. But really, I was avoiding picking up pencils, pens, or brushes. And I hadn't had that in a really long time, and it caught me a bit unawares. And I just luckily got to the point where the fear of producing something and it not being very good, or being worried about how it's going to be, was outweighed by my need to paint or draw. I really wanted to do something creative, and luckily that helped me break through this. But it wasn't something I'm used to feeling, and I can totally understand now when people are commenting on the videos and talking about how, you know, they need to get back into something and they've fallen out of love with something and it's tricky and they haven't got the confidence. I totally understand where you're coming from. And the only kind of advice that I can give is sit down, small piece of paper, small sketchbook, pen, pencil, whatever you're most comfortable with, and just jump in, doodle, draw, sketch, whatever it is. Because I think that kind of art block, or the fear, as I like to call it, it can affect every single one of us. Everybody, from a seasoned pro to you know, the person just starting out. You might think, oh, they're the ones that are going to be most worried about, you know, this kind of thing and get artist block. But it just hits everybody. So the best thing you can do is just remember how much you love to create stuff and just jump right in, because that's what ultimately helped me start setting up these videos and start to produce these. So you can see me finishing off the very last cherry tomato on this kind of circle, this kind of ring of cherry tomatoes. Exactly the same idea, put on that lighter color first and then dropping in these much rawer bits of color straight from the half pan and letting them run about. And again, I've left the light areas, all of those white areas, all of those paper highlights, I've left those as I've been going along. As you see me do this last cherry tomato, which is separate from all the rest. It's almost like a necklace with this kind of pendant of a cherry tomato at the bottom. I'm doing this exactly the same way, painting it in with this big fat brush, trying not to get too fussy, but again, leaving those light areas, those paper white highlights on there as I go, trying not to obliterate them with the big brush. And of course, because I'm adding color to already wet paint, that's what allows it to just flood around and move around and do that kind of thing that watercolors do, where the colors just start to merge and hopefully blend together. So now you're going to see me do something I wouldn't normally do either. I'm going to put in the background, but as you can tell, the cherry tomatoes I've already painted have not dried yet. So there is going to be a real chance here that as I put in the background, if that brush of a light wash of Payne's Grey that I'm preparing there touches against that wet tomato color, the two are going to run together, the two are going to bleed, and it's not going to have those lovely crisp outline edges that I normally go for. But this is deliberate. Again, I'm thinking, just let it go, you know. I'm just trying to paint in here and let the kind of watercolor, you know, run about a little bit. Be like those really lovely, fluid, expressive versions of watercolors that I see and wish that I could produce as well. So that's why I'm beginning to paint. And you can see a little bit of that tomato is just in the very center, is flooded now into the Payne's Grey, and it's given me this lovely kind of, and now I'm popping in a little bit of Payne's Grey that's a little bit darker, not straight from the half pan, but it's a little bit darker, mixed on my palette there. And I'm just helping it kind of blend and run into the background color that I'm using, which is just Payne's Grey, just a single color again that I have watered down and made a really pale wash of. And that's what I'm going to do in the background. And then I'm going to add slightly darker and deeper shadows around the edges of the, as you can see me doing just there, while it's still wet, adding that slightly darker Payne's Grey, slightly more raw Payne's Grey, not so dilute. So I'm going to get some lovely fuzzy kind of shadows on this, what is the sort of like right-hand side of most of these cherry tomatoes. But I'm not just going to add Payne's Grey shadows, make the shadows darker. I'm also going to introduce a little bit of color. You might have seen me do that a little bit on the very top left cherry tomato when I was adding the shadow there. I'll dip the brush, there you go, into some of the red and just dot little bits of red paint into the Payne's Grey, because these are red tomatoes on a white surface. So you are going to get a little bit of reflected light from the red tomatoes on the white surface of the table that they're on. So I really want to do that, you know, not just use Payne's Grey for a shadow, but I want to kind of add that red, little bits of red, the cadmium scarlet in there as well, to show that reflected light on the table. And hopefully it will also ground them a little bit better as well and make it really certain that those cherry tomatoes are kind of connected to that table. They're on top of, they're sitting on top of that table, because you've got that kind of little bit of red in the shadows that kind of joins and connects, makes a connection to the actual painting of the cherry tomatoes themselves. And there you see me dealing with one of the issues of using very, very fluid, very, very wet paint. I'm trying to work quickly, and as I move the brush across quickly, sometimes a little bit of that watery fluid paint gets splattered across the page. And actually, since I'm painting this expressively, what I could have done is just leave those splatters, not touch them, say, hey, that's part of the overall effect, that's what I'm going for, they look great, stop being fussy. But I did, the little bit of fussiness came out of me there, and I had to kind of wipe them away, and you saw me blotting it with a piece of tissue paper as well. You might be watching this also and thinking, oh, why is he not getting any drying lines? Well, even though this is speeded up, this is at twice the speed of what I painted it at. So it's not exactly real time, but it's just twice the speed. I am working very quickly. Because I hate getting drying lines. I don't want to get any of those. So because I'm covering quite a large area in this background with this Payne's Grey wash, I'm using the big brush still, and I'm also working very, very quickly. So if I get in a little bit here, in the sort of nook and cranny, that's a bit tricky, it's going to take up my time. By the time I come back out and I try and blend the rest of the large areas of colour back in, hopefully they won't have dried and produced a drying line, because I really don't like those. So as I'm painting up this bit here, just decide to pause and point out in this top corner here, what I have done is I've added way too much water up there, clean water, and it has kind of had that kind of explosive bloom effect, and everything's pushed all of the colour outwards. But again, it's an expressive watercolor, so I'm just going to shrug my shoulders and say, that's okay, that's all right, it's not what I intended, but it's okay, I can totally live with that in the sort of the wider scheme of the painting. And yes, this probably doesn't sound like me. If you've watched those other videos and you've seen how tight that painting is, I'd be worried about something like that in one of my other paintings. But for this one, I'm okay with it, absolutely fine. And what I'm showing you there is, as I'm adding some of these colors, what's happened is the paper is slightly cockled and slightly warped a little bit, and that paint that I'm putting on now is beginning to pool in this what looks like the top of the picture, because of course the paper is sort of like created crests and troughs, and that's a bit of a trough near where those two top tomatoes meet, and the really fluid paint is now beginning to run downhill kind of and into that, and that's where you can see a very dark droplet there that is pooling away. Again, could leave it kind of bloom in its own time, but I do have a plan for that. And just to give you an idea, look at that. That is the tissue paper that I've got next to the brushes. Look how sodden they are with the amount of water I'm using. Now here you go, next to the reference photo, so you can see how it's beginning to shape up. And I am worried that that is going to be a very distracting effect. So what I do with that bit of pooled Payne's Grey, so just go in with a bit of tissue paper and I just gently blot it away. Now I'm moving on to doing the stalks, and I do decide to move down a brush here. So I'm using a size 3 round here. As you can see, it's a lot thinner than that size 8. And I'm mixing a bunch of colors here, so I'm having to. And I've left the palette in the whole of this video, so you can see exactly how I'm mixing, the amounts that I'm mixing and the kind of colors that I'm beginning to get. So I'm using cadmium yellow and scarlet green, but I think that's going to be clearly too bright a green, so I do introduce a little bit of burnt sienna here, a bit of brown, in order to just dull and make that green a bit more of an earthy kind of tomato stalk kind of green. You can also see me testing on the very edge of the piece of paper up at the top right there, just testing, just putting little blobs of the green as I mix it up there to check whether it's going to be the right kind of color that I want, if it's pale enough, if it's too dark. But of course I want this to be pale, just like the tomatoes are pale. I'm doing the stalks as a pale green to begin with, thinking, well, maybe I can make them darker with a second wash afterwards. So here you see me again trying to hold that size 3 brush a lot higher up. I'm holding it, about mid-barrel on the brush, because I don't want to be too controlling with it. I want it to have a little bit more of a kind of loose, expressive feel to those lines, and that's why I'm holding it halfway up in order to hopefully make it a bit more expressive. So some of these stalks, some of the leaves on these tomatoes, I'm doing by working from the center outwards with each of the leaves, and some of them I'm kind of using the brush, putting the brush down gently and then pressing it down more towards the center. Here you go, like that. So I'm using two different techniques to do the stalks on these cherry tomatoes. I'm not exactly sure why. I think I was trying to be experimental, see if one brushstroke differed greatly from another, but also sometimes it just made sense to do obviously the ones that were coming from the left to the right to start out at their tip and then make them thicker towards the center, and vice versa with the ones that start on the right. I'd start in the middle and just flick gently out towards the right hand side. You might be watching this and thinking, but hang on, he's painting the green over the top of the red. So, in a kind of glazing kind of way, that's going to create brown. Green and red makes brown. Why didn't I just leave white lines for where I wanted the stalks to go and then paint the green on afterwards? Because it would be brighter and stronger and more colorful because it would be straight onto white paper. Yeah, I could have done that. But what I usually find is if you try and do something like that, and indeed sometimes using masking fluid is a good way of doing things like that, you'll get a very strong, very hard kind of edge where the two paints meet, where the green paint would meet the red paint. This way of doing it, first of all, I'm using a very, very pale green to begin with anyway. So I'm popping this pale green over the top, and it's just giving me an idea of where the green areas need to be. And I know in my heart that I'm probably going to add some darker green areas to it later, to the stalks. So it's just kind of like plotting it out. But also, I didn't want really super hard edges between the greens and the reds on the tomato. So I thought, I'll just lay the green over the top here, and when I start to add darker greens to it later, then, that'll probably be okay, and that'll probably mask the slight browniness that you get from obviously putting green over the top of red. At least I'm hoping that that's what would happen in the future. So at this stage, it was pretty much finished. And when it dried, this is what it looked like. Completely different, I think you'll agree, to the kind of stuff that I usually do. Let me know in the comments below what you think of it so far. And what I could have done is leave it completely like that. But could I leave it like that? And should I leave it like that? Because you've seen the reference photo and you know how deep those reds are. So this should give you a good idea. Next time, in the next video, I'm going to show what I did next, because I couldn't just leave it alone and I had to go in there and add more saturated reds and browns. Thanks for watching.